There's a significant part of me that believes that amidst a sea of compelling attributes, it's the humor of Super Mario RPG that truly elevates it to a higher level of greatness. I am, by and large, a comedy snob. Something I more or less have to do, given that my day job is essentially just gatekeeping projects based on how funny I think they are. Also, as happens when one works day in and day out with anything, it's pretty easy to become a cynic, since I work at all things comedy and interact with all things comedy. There are times when I very much feel like that comedy cynic, trying to sift through the endless torrent of comic material that doesn't really work in hopes of the ever rare stuff that does. But the humor in Super Mario RPG will always warm my cold Mr. Potter-esque heart. Mario RPGs have gone on to be known for their comedy chops, and they came out of the gate firing with this one. This game is just downright funny, pretty much at all times. Almost every scripted moment injects some levity, whether with slapstick character animations, Pixar silly dialogue, hilarious doppelganging pantomimes where characters literally become other characters for the purposes of telling a story, and leaning into the common absurdity of a lot of the plot points.